and I welcome you to the 25th anniversary. Oh yes, please put on your kimono.
This is my traveling crown.
Yes, you wouldn't want to use the grand bejeweled crown we decided this year, since it is the 25th anniversary, to have a founders panel and discussion of a little bit of the history and the culture of Cider Days, and also since you're all paying money, we decided to have a lot of cider being passed around so that you weren't just listening to us gas on for an hour or so about the past and the future and things like that. The past, present, and future. Did you say that Charlie is going to be the ghost of Christmas to come?
No, he's the present. I'm the past.
And Paul is the ghost of Christmas to come. But I just want to introduce everybody. I am actually not a founder of Cider Days. I've only been working for a mere, I've only been coming since 1997 or so, and so I'm just a piker. And I've only been doing this volunteering for about 12 or 13 years. But these folks here are actually from the inception on were the creators of what you now know as Cider Days. So to my left, to my far left, is Paul Correnty, whose book, The Art of Cidermaking, stimulated this whole thing. It is out of print, but it is still available somewhere, I'm sure. And Paul and Charlie Olchowski next to him, who have been in charge of the traditional, which I'm sure they'll talk more about, the traditional sort of impetus of Cider Days, which was before there were a lot of commercial producers, people were learning how to make cider, and so we still have that strong component to Cider Days of being something that for home cider makers and amateur cider. And some people who have been amateur cider makers who've come here have turned into commercial producers too. And last but certainly not least, in fact first, is our pomona for this year, Judith Maloney, who co-founded of this town. Co-founder of West County, originally West County Winery, now West County Ciders.
Because they wouldn't let us say cider works. We had to say winery because we made it out of fruit.
How long ago was that?
Beginning of time. 1984, 1983.
And we're off and running. The first cider that you have in front of you, I'm going to pass it. This is a good segue. I'm going to pass to Judith, and she can talk a little bit about this and also some of the context around this area.
Okay.
Here, they said I talk too quiet. Okay. So we ended up in a zone. This zone here is an apple zone. There are quite a few apple zones in New England. It was like, oh, apples. Oh, we got to do something with these apples. We better make hard cider. And we had our neighbors. It was like we lived in a place. This area, there was still my neighbors. They had this is Hager's hard cider. The young son the young grandson of the guy I know, Albert Hager. They made this. He is very proud of this cider, and it's very clean. But I wanted you to understand that there was this tradition all around here of people who got through the seasons by lightening winter. And this is how they lighten this is like you use what you have and you enjoy it. And I really liked having neighbors who would say, oh, I want you to come taste my cider. You go, you have the cider, and you think, whoa, I don't know about this. And they would, but it was there, and it was given, and it was like, boy, I'm so lucky I get to be given this. And when I was raised in San Francisco, I knew some people up in the Napa Valley. When they get together, I didn't feel like they talked about it with the same, like, oh, we made this and we love it. It had to have attributes. And I thought, this is a good place to come to start making hard cider. And of course, there are all these colleges around here, and there was one place up in the hills called Dewey's. They called him Dr. Dewey. And Dr. Dewey would sell half gallons or gallons of cider and be pleased. And all these guys from UMass, underage, would come and they'd be sent to the basement. He'd choose what degree of fermentation you should have. And anyway, that was probably the beginning of commercial hard cider in the valley. And so when we started making hard cider, we ended up, I met these two jokers. And it was through them, like Charlie with the idea that we should be doing a lot of teaching, and Paul with the idea that there were a lot of beer makers, there were a lot of witches in Salem who were making hard cider, and that we should all unite in the back room of my tasting room. And that's it. Somebody would stand on a table, sing a song, and we'd all drink. And then, what?
That would be you.
Yes. Oh, right. So I think this is a very clean, good cider, and I can't tell you what apples it was made from, and I think that just as at the Bring Your Own Cider, there are quite a few people who have their favorite wild apples, apple trees, and they know where to go, and it changes year by year. And all the normal things that you guys know about. And we made cider. We started making cider in '84. There was no market. The market, when I got to Boston, was a few stores who were selling it to the Irish guys who were coming over here to work, which that was not in the '80s. We started making it in '84, and I started selling it to Boston in the '90s. So we had a few Irish pubs and a few places, and then what really made it happen was the idea of local and Alice Waters, and suddenly those who would not answer my request that they try our cider were very eager to. And I guess when we were making it. Basically, there was a dairy buyout program in Massachusetts for the persons who the dairies were asked to get, the small ones were asked to go out, so there was a lot of small stainless. And my husband really relied on a few people who he could talk to and who were sort of rubbing against the same tree. One was Steve Wood.
Who's here.
Who's here somewhere.
And we're going to be drinking one of his ciders.
Yeah. And another was this guy who came, and I think he probably thought he might get a book out of it. Which he did. He got books from various people, etc. So if anybody has questions, I'll answer them. Is that how we do it?
Well, they've got a microphone over there.
So you're tasting this cider from it's farm cider.
3 cheers for 25 years. Hooray! 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 There we go. Here's my little story. I had been making cider as soon as I came to New England because I saw the apple trees. And the only people that I learned from were the farmers who lived I live in Pepperell, Massachusetts, and the farmers around there made it as their farm drink. And I tried it. It was like sometimes really good, sometimes really funky, but I felt I could do something with this. So I joined a home brewing group, the Boston Wort Processors, and a group out of New Hampshire called Brew Free or Die. And I learned how to make beer, and I made good beer, and I taught them how to make cider. So every year we'd have a party in the orchard, and we did this at Anderson Fruit Farms. We did it at various places for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and had brewers come up, have a big party, obviously, and then get juice from that farm, from that cider mill, and we'd come back, you know, and drink the stuff from the year before. One year I went to a conference in Belchertown, Massachusetts, about what New England farms could do to increase the revenue or to diversify because they were failing. They were selling their land off to home developers. And there were maybe 175 people in this big room, and they had a woman from the Washington State Apple Board speaking in front of these New England farmers. And she was, you know, very corporate looking, and she had on her desk a beautiful Washington State delicious apple. I was talking about how they developed the brand, and you know, that's the forum. And from the other side of the room, a woman got up and asked a question. She said, well, what about hard cider? And the woman said that it was that nasty drink that you find at the bottom of at the back of your fridge when you forget about the sweet side. So the woman across the room got up and walked out, and I followed her out. And we went to her. She said, well, you know, come, let's talk about this. So we went and sat on the back of a pickup truck and enjoyed some of.
I thought we were under a tree.
We were under a tree.
Oh, and then we moved on.
We moved on.
Okay.
And we sat and drank some of Terry and Judith's cider from West County Winery. Wonderful. And we discussed that we could have a woman from Washington State with a Washington State apple in front of us telling us what to do. That just wasn't right, because we knew we had the best apple anywhere right here. So we discussed a way to save the farms from selling their land and educating people on how to make hard cider. Because unlike beer, you didn't have to boil the grain from somewhere else and cool it down. And unlike grape wine, you didn't have to get grapes from somewhere else and crush them and press them. We had the best right here. So we talked about this, and Judith spoke to her husband, Terry, and spoke to Charlie Olchowski, who was already president of the Valley Fermenters. And the 4 of us got together and had the first cider day that consisted of 28 very drunken people. And I'm glad to see after last night and today, we've continued that tradition. Because it is about the ambiance, it is about the fun, it is about the camaraderie, it is about the love. Thank you. That's how we started. At some point, you're going to have 2 of my ciders. I'm going to pass this.
I think those are next. I think those are the ones we're pouring next.
One is,
Let's talk about this.
we can talk about this one, and the next 2, one is an original, a Yankee original, which is New England bourbon barrel cider. That was started, yeah, some of the yeehaws, which started with cranky Yankee New England farmers being frugal, and in New Hampshire, there's state liquor stores. So New Hampshire state would get bourbon in barrel and bottle it themselves and give the barrels to the Yankee farmers who would make cider in these barrels year after year. So it's a funny connection. And then secondly, a cider that's become very popular with people that make cider, the fruit ciders, which I think came out of Cider Days. This was the tank where all these great cider makers, well, many great cider makers came through. So that's an elderberry cider. So we'll have those 2 next. Charlie?
Anyway, I'm going to add to it is that I think there was sort of like a harmonic convergence to get Cider Days going. And it was fortuitous with me. I was on the Association of Brewers Board of Directors, and then they have a publication division. And they said, hey, we got a manuscript here for a really good book on cider making. And as you know, brewers are really getting interested in that segment of the home brewing hobby. But he sucks as a photographer. And they knew that I had some background in photojournalism, so they hired me to take pictures. So where am I going to take pictures? Well, right around here where I live. And apples and cider have been part of my life since I was a youngster. I was born in Greenfield and raised here. Clarkdale, I always remember going there with my parents, and later going on, thank you Judith, say my mother too, and going to Pine Hill Orchards. But the smells of, especially after the vintage was picked, were so overpowering going to Clarkdale, that cold atmosphere with all the aromas, and it was always beckoning to me. So when I got old enough to know that alcohol is fun, but too young to buy it, I started making hard cider. So they were one of the first few places around here that made pressed juice. It was an hard cider mill out on Green River Road. They've gone under. But anyway, everyone around here that was really in tune with the agricultural atmosphere of this valley, got into drinking sweet cider and eventually hard cider. But going on, so I photographed using all the cider mills and all the apple orchards in the region. And when we're trying to get the idea of what to do with the book signing, which is dull and boring, I said, let's do a tour of all these places. And the unfortunate thing of all this is Greenwood Farm up in Northfield, Mass. On Route 63. All they grew was heirloom apples, old apples, really obscure apples. And they made the most sumptuous, beautiful sweet cider. Of course, we made hard cider out of it. And they've gone to the wayside since that time. And they're a large part of this book's photographs. But anyway, I think one of the reasons cider really took off is I've been involved with the beer judge certification program since the beginning. Am I that soft when I spoke? Okay. And the first cider makers went to the American Wine Society to find a place where they could judge their ciders. And they weren't too welcoming. But when they came to the beer judge certification program people, they had already been exposed to ciders in that it's something that can be made a lot easier than even making beer. Because as you know, wort, once it gets below 120 degrees Fahrenheit, every microbe in the world wants to grow in it. But cider, just throw SO2 into it if you believe it, you go to a cider mill, pick it up, and you let it go. You make a softer drink that's acceptable by a lot more people other than beer. And so we made the category for meads and ciders within every competition here in New England. And wow, it started to grow just like the beer movement grew. So I'm not saying we're credited for the growth of cider, but it was very parallel, and it was a welcoming audience to expand the making of cider and all the technology that went with it. And on it went to become, well, look, here we are, 25 years into this event.
I wanted to, before we start pouring the next one, I wanted to talk a little bit about the cider that you have in front of you, which is a West County. Ren de Pomme is one that is intensely bitter. I mean, it really is. When people talk about spitters, sometimes, the apples can be tannic or not very pleasant or a little astringent. This one really is inedible. And I know that because Steve Wood was here a few years ago, and many years ago now, right before Terry passed, and he and Terry did a workshop that was very interesting. It was very hard to pull off too, but we had fresh fruit, the fruit from the tree, the fresh cider that was pressed from it, and then the fermented cider. And it took about, Steve, 2 years to figure out how to do this, how to pull it off, but it was interesting, and I remember that Ren de Pomme was probably the most bitter apple that we did, but it lends itself to a very, very distinguished cider, and even the first aroma in the nose, I think, is really interesting of this. I don't know if you want to say anything more about the Ren de Pomme.
Well, the Ren de Pomme. Well, there's an argument about the Ren de Pomme, whether you should call it Ren de Pomme with an S at the end, or whether it's Ren de Pomme. And I I think in France, I saw it on the board with a DE. So, but now we have it with a DES. Somebody's made it more grammatical. But besides that, I think the interest, so when we started, we'd read about what the French had for apples and what the English had for apples. So Steve was able to grow large amounts, but we would grow so we knew what these apples tasted like, which was, it could be 4 trees or a row of trees. And I think when I'm talking to the younger ones, the ones who are making their own, who are going tree to tree, and they know wild trees in their neighborhood, and they're creating cider out of wild trees, apples. America has this tradition which has to do with America created seedling cider. There were a lot of seedling ciders in America, and because they didn't have names, and I think that the people who are foraging for making their own cider, it's like they're unnamed apples, a lot of them, but it's kind of, instead of paying honor to the French or the English, it's using what's there. And there are all kinds of old tales about people who brought scions in their shoes and so on and so forth from other countries. And God bless them.
This was made in true cider maker style, home cider makers. It's early in the year juice that is generally lower in acid, lower in sugar, lower in tannin than later season juice. But the fruits pick that up, so you just ferment it. I had a cup of sugar per gallon. Get it going with the D47 white wine yeast. I like that because it preserves a lot of the fruit, and a lot of the aroma. And is this the funky one?
Yes.
Okay. They're fermented together for about a month and then racked off into a clean carboy, put a water lock on it, and ferment.
It's the bottom. It's the connection on the bottom. That's the problem. So if you press
And fermented at cool temperature. That's the key to keeping the fruit. 55, 60 tops. And serve it, keep it 6 months until it clears, and bottle it. Elderberries were taken from a secret spot in Littleton, Massachusetts. But there's, as you know, elderberries are all over the place. Do you like it? I do. So there you go. Charles?
If you don't mind, I wanted to go back into some of your comments you made just a little earlier, and there's 2 anecdotal pieces. One, in the early days of CiderDays, it was only 1 day long, and quite often at the end of that day we ended up at Terry and Judith's house for sort of a potluck dinner, but the neighbors eventually chipped into a big banquet. This is annoying, all right? And one of our guests,
turn it on. Here, push the button.
Is it on?
No, you gotta turn the button on. Push the button on. Right on the side. There you go.
obviously Ben talks all over the world, so he knows how to run these things. Anyway, so the morning after, we usually had breakfast at Terry and Judith as well. One of our guest speakers was Ian Merwin from Cornell. At the time, he was probably the foremost pomologist in the country. And so Terry, Ian and I went out for a walk in West County's orchard. And as we got to one group of fairly young trees, Terry, of course, was proud as a peacock. I look at these, I'm not even sure what variety they were, but Ian sort of looked at underneath them and said, well, in the first few years, you can't have any measuring competition with the grass. You're really going to use a thin layer of wood chips. And if you don't do that, the root growth's not going to be there to sustain it over the years of all your vintages. And slowly but surely, I saw poor Terry's body language change from a proud man to a guy that was beaten. And then I found out within a month or two of that walk, he bulldozed all those trees down because he wanted
What
us.
are bulldoze?
What would you do? Something. I thought it was bulldoze.
Oh,
He pulled them. He did it by hand. So that shows you the early struggles of this cider movement in our country. The knowledge wasn't all there, and we're still learning again. What was the other thing?
well, we weren't really orchardists, you know, it was definitely starting from scratch.
And another quick story. About roughly 15 years ago, I was up at Piney Orchards talking to David Shearer, who runs the operation of the Sun Mat now. And he was about to go with a tractor trailer load of apples that were going to go to J.P. Sullivan, an apple distributor in the central part of the state. And he did the mathematics, and he'd lose $1 a bushel if he drove them to their thing, so he dumped them in a ravine. And that was as little as 15 years ago. So it really showed you how dramatic the economics of this movement can really affect it. All I can say now, it's very, very positive out there.
Well, we're reminiscing here. Might as well reminisce away. We used to have cider dinners. I don't know if, how many of us have gone to the cider dinners? There we go. And they were a part of CiderDays for many years, and it just brought the whole camaraderie of CiderDays together. We had them here, use this kitchen. Myself and a group of friends and volunteers would prepare a meal for, at one point we did 375, and truck it over here and reassemble it and reheat it. And we managed to, and CiderDays has always been really ahead of the curve. Cider was popular. There's a new thing that you can grow in your garden that's now legal, that wasn't legal when we started. And we managed to corrupt the local police department one night to allow us to partake in both of these substances. At one of our dinners for an appetizer, we had stuffies. Now, I don't know if you know what stuffies is. It's a stuffed clam. It usually comes about this big, but a friend of mine in the seafood business said, you really want to wow for the dinner. We paraded these out and put them on the table. So we had sea clam shells that were probably as big as this platter. And we invited the local police to come have dinner with us. And they managed to take a stuffy each and make their way as best they could through it. So they were unable to pursue the aromas wafting up from the cellar of the building we were in as they were consuming their stuffies. That was our main financial, I think,
The most money we
the
made.
most money we made until there were enough commercial cideries to have the salon, which is now, I believe, the largest or has the most varieties.
We're not in it for that reason.
We're not in it for that reason.
I can talk about that later.
Okay, but it just shows the amount of business and the growth in this industry where 25 years ago, there was really West County, Ace on the West Coast, Woodchuck in Vermont, and I think, Steve, you were in business then, right? Or it just started?
Oh, it started growing in 1965.
All right. No, I mean in actually making. Yeah. So there really wasn't even a cider category in the beverages, but now look where it is. It's everywhere. You can find it in supermarkets and at your VFW.
I think you all agree with this. One of the interesting things is, well, when we started selling cider, like you thought, okay, get Boston, because you have the right, you have farm winery license, etc. But there was no market. So, I mean, they put us in weird places like next to Sake and all kinds of the weird stuff. The no alcohol cider. And over time, I mean, it was partly the relationships to do with cider, to do with coming in and selling it in a door-to-door way, but I think it's much harder now. Like, basically, in the last couple of years when I go out, which I'm now retired, but when I go out, it was like, who's your distributor? And they didn't want to really, they weren't that eager to deal one-on-one with a small producer. And there are so many cider makers. So I think in a way, there was a certain amount of it being more easy because it could be more direct, like person to person, which always helps. And it was also that there wasn't that much competition that was selling in Massachusetts. And now, let's say, there's a whole category, there's a whole, in the cooler, they've gone from regular size beer cans, it's like 9 ounce, right? So not only are we using bottles, but besides, as so many of the small producers are, but it's 9 ounce, and the coolers in a lot of the better stores are designed for 9 ounce cans. So it's like, oh well, this thing has transformed itself.
Yeah, I remember when I first started working on my book was probably around 96 or 97 maybe, and doing research and finding out more about cider, which I was already interested in. And Steve was very generous with his time, as he always is, and I interviewed him a lot and bugged him a lot about things. And Terry and Judith were great. But I think at that time, I think I had a list. I've been keeping a database ever since then, and I think it might have been maybe generously 24 people, probably fewer, around the country were actually producing commercially. And now, there's no way I can keep up with it. I mean, my database is just for my own information because it's certainly not exhaustive, and I think there must be over 1,000 cider producers in the country. It's just exploded and I tell people that it was the one thing when I talked to the publisher about doing a book on cider, it was the one correct prediction I've ever made in my entire life. Because I said to them, well, it's growing organically, but I think it's poised to really be big. And they went, okay, right about that. And so I wrote this book, and then, of course, nothing happened for 5 years, and then everything exploded, and a bunch of other people wrote books that have actually sold well. So that's good, but that's pretty typical for me. I want to talk about the cider salon a little bit later when we bring out the next cider. So maybe we can start pouring that, and I'll comment on it now. But I just want to say I really like Paul's bourbon barrel-aged cider here, and he talked a little bit about it. But are we all enjoying that? Very well done.
Besides the fact that it tastes delicious, you can always ask somebody to come down the cellar and look at your big beer.
The cider that we're pouring now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the cider salon and how that got started, because that's the one thing that I will take some credit or blame for doing, since around 2000, I think it was around 2006 or 2000. Terry said, oh, what a great idea. You're in charge of it. Thanks. So that first year, I went back to our records, and we had 13 producers participated, including some people who are here this weekend, like Mike Beck, who's not here right now. Oh, he is? Oh, sorry, I didn't even see. I thought you went to the other one. But Mike Beck is here, and he was in the first salon. Uncle John's Cider from Michigan. And sort of the idea of it was, I wanted people to experience good ciders from different places, not just from the locality or ones that they could get, because there was a very limited number of ones you could get. But this cider that we have in front of us is Autumn's Gold, which is one of the flagship ciders for Eve's Cidery out in western New York, out in the Finger Lakes. And Autumn Stoschek was another person who was here this weekend and who has been a supporter of Cider Days for a long, long time and has been participating in most, maybe not all, but most of the cider salons since 2008, and she was in that original one. But the thing I wanted to point out, there were 13 producers represented, and a lot of them didn't come, but didn't actually attend, but there were 25 brands that we had in the salon guide. And I did this year's salon guide and count, and there were this year 52 producers represented, and over 130 brands that we had at the salon, a lot of you went to. So we had quadruple the number of producers involved and quintuple or more the amount of ciders that we had in that first. So that sort of gives you an indication of how much cider has grown in the country. But enjoy Autumn Cider, because I think they make some really, really excellent stuff, and they're doing good work out there.
If you look at the schedule, it's become one of the centers of educational sharing in the cider industry. There are very technical workshops as well as very easy to start workshops. So a lot of education comes out of Cider Days, unlike just a plain beer festival where they just have a salon. We have a lot of different things here. I'd also noticed over the past number of years, Judith and Terry have passed their cidery along to their son Field, but so many of the producers come from a younger generation that find it feasible and worthy to continue a family farm or a family orchard or family business, whereas in years past there just wasn't enough money in making cider, either sweet or hard, to make a go of it. And I think that's Cider Days and the whole growth of the industry has had a huge impact on the continuity of family businesses in small communities and the benefits that these give. I think it's been an important part of Cider Day, and one that I thank all of you for helping contribute towards.
Diane and Terry Maloney had the idea of coming up with this idea of a cider forum, and then had the idea of giving it to me to help organize that too. That seems to be the way things work at Cider Days. That's a great idea, give it to Ben, he can do it. But we've had meetings, as Mike said, at various places of get-togethers in the early years of a lot of commercial cider makers or would-be cider makers coming and meeting and talking about issues that were of concern to them, and about, should we have a regional organization? How do we form a national organization? And dealing with sort of nitty-gritty issues that had come up on the thing. And that was really her drive that helped do that. At the time, she owned Foggy Ridge Cider down in Southwest Virginia. But she's responsible for that along with Terry, and it was her suggestion to Terry. And as Mike says, that really, helped. It seemed like it was just a bunch of guys hanging out and talking, and are we really doing anything year to year? But out of that, the discussions and the networking, the National Cider Makers Association has come together, and I think it's just great to see how much it's grown. For this cider, and actually for the next one, the last one that we have, I want to engage Steve Wood, who's here, Farnham Hill Ciders, and this is his extra dry cider, which is reflective of what he's been doing for a long time and developing for a long time, and sort of representative of what he liked for years. But I'll let him talk about it a little bit in terms of we're looking forward. Segue into pouring our last cider, which is probably familiar to some of you. Perhaps you started out tasting something like this, and I think that was sort of the rationale for doing this. Not only was Woodchuck and Vermont Cider Company, you know, we won't go into the whole history of it, but I just know Paul and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and we remember that back in the late 80s, we tried Joseph Cernelia's ciders, and he was making a cider as well as apple wines, and then it became, a few years later, it became Woodchuck Cider. And it's remarkably similar to the cider that they were making in those days. Maybe it's evolved a little bit, but they were important because they opened the market, and you know, they made it possible for along with people like West County and Steve making really quality craft, smaller scale, you know, ciders, orchard grown ciders. They really opened a segment of the market, and they helped to raise the visibility of cider in the United States, and I think that that's really important. So we wanted to pour it for you at the end of the tasting.
I mean, who cannot smile when you're in the supermarket and you see real needy, and you say, real needy on ice? You know what? It was then. And this is still good. It's ours. Enjoy it. Don't feel guilty. But now we have a choice. We should go from sweet to dry. We didn't have it.
Right. Well, we're up against the time. Please enjoy the rest of your Woodchuck. if you do enjoy it, or dispense with it if you want. Thank you all for coming. We have time. We can stay here for a few minutes if anybody has any questions or wants to ask the founders anything. Bill.
I wanted to answer Paul's question about why we're here. So, I think the short answer is there's nowhere else in the country anywhere like this. I mean, it's the only place where you have the connection between, you know, the orchards in the area with the amateur cider makers, and the commercial cider makers, and just the apple lovers, all combined with the education and the history of the place. And it's beautiful, and thank you for starting it.
I'm a private individual with a few apple trees. I got back from studying in France for a year in 1985 and having found the joy of Cider, which I didn't know before. And I went looking all over Boston for something. I found an Irish bar in Cambridge that had it. And then I walked into the liquor store in Fresh Pond. Right. And they had, for $4.95, bottles of West County cider. And you're right, they were in a weird place. I had to hunt around the store for them every time I went there. But for 15 years, if I wanted a bottle of hard cider, I could go to that liquor store and I could find West County cider until other people started catching on. So thank you.